Landcare, and it is our pleasure to be working with Sunshine Coast Environment Council to bring you this online event. I would like to acknowledge that I'm on Jinabara country tonight and pay respects to the traditional custodians of this land, as well as the Kabi people whose land we also meet on here on the Sunshine Coast. I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their deep and continuing connection to land, water and culture. So thank you all for joining us here tonight. This event is one of a series of events that are part of the very first Sunshine Coast Big Butterfly Count. We, Barung Landcare, hosted our very first survey on the weekend and had so much fun just searching for butterfly species in our seed forest up here in Mullaney, which is only about 18 months old. And we were really pleasantly surprised to see just how much that budding ecosystem is supporting already. It certainly got me really passionate and curious about the world of butterflies, and more importantly, the roles that insects can play in the ecosystem. So the Sunshine Coast Big Butterfly Count has been inspired by the Brisbane Big Butterfly Count, and it's a joint collaboration between Sunshine Coast Council, Brisbane Catchments Network, Sunshine Coast Environment Council, Coolum Community Native Nursery, Forest Heart Nursery, Mooloolah River Landcare, and of course Barung Landcare. And what we're really about is encouraging the local community to work together to help us to understand more about the species that call the very special and diverse environments we have here on the Sunshine Coast home. Because the more we know about what lives here, the more we can make more informed decisions about how to look after and protect this environment. So this week, we're encouraging people to download the Big Butterfly Count app. You can also use iNaturalist to log even more species. And then throughout the week, monitoring butterflies either in your backyard or out in a local environment, as well as joining a public event or a workshop. And we'll share the link at the end of this webinar on how you can get involved and how to log on and register for the things that you might be keen to get involved in. Now, in terms of tech tonight, just a few little instructions. If you are joining us via Zoom, you're most welcome to submit questions using the Q&A box, so not the chat, the Q&A. And we'll be monitoring that throughout the evening. And if we have a little bit of time at the end, we'll be asking our presenter some of those questions. And Natalie will also be monitoring our Facebook live stream, which is currently on the Sunshine Coast Environment Council page, if you happen to be joining us there. So tonight, we're really lucky to be joined by Professor Roger Kitching, who is going to share his knowledge about all things butterflies, but with a particular focus on butterfly species, a little bit about their conservation here in Southeast Queensland, and more specifically here on the Sunshine Coast. Professor Roger Kitching is a rainforest ecologist with special expertise in the biology, conservation and management of invertebrate biodiversity. He has led major projects in Queensland examining the response of biodiversity to projected climate change. He has research interests in forests from France to Borneo, Australia to Panama, and he is the author or co-author or editor or co-editor of 13 books on a range of ecological subjects, and has also authored or co-authored over 265 refereed scientific articles. But an undercurrent through all of Roger's scientific work has been his lifelong passion for butterflies and more recently moths. He has edited and co-authored a number of books on butterflies and has been involved for many years in generating the scientific base for the conservation of Australian butterflies. So welcome, Roger. Just invite you to share your screen with us, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to share with us tonight.
Thank you, Megan. That's a very flattering and nice introduction. Before I start, first of all, let me just see that we can, let me see, where's my talk gone? Always happens when you sorry folks, suddenly I've lost my talk. Bear with me, it can't be that difficult. All right, momentito, as they say. Good. Is that Megan and Natalie? Is that clear? Is that visible?
Beautiful. Thank you, Roger.
All right. I'm sorry about that. We had it perfectly before the introduction. All right. Well, what I'm going to do this evening, first of all, is to thank the organizers for inviting me to talk to you and to encourage passion for butterflies, which I've always had since my early teenage years. When other people were chasing girls, I was chasing butterflies, I'm afraid, and girls, incidentally. I discovered that in France, papillon, which means butterfly, also means young ladies that young men might choose. So it worked perfectly well in France. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a very general introduction. I'm quite sure some of you listening know at least as much about butterflies as I do, so forgive me if I'm too basic for you. But then in question time, I think we should address, or you can ask me about my viewpoints and thoughts on conservation issues. So I'm going to talk about what and where, and then in our discussion period, we can talk about how long. So a little bit of context. Teaching my grandmother to suck eggs, perhaps, is butterflies are Lepidoptera, which is one of the 4 mega orders, that is, orders of insects, which probably, if we ever got our heads around them, have close to 1 million species worldwide, along with the beetles and the flies and the ants, bees and wasps, the Hymenoptera. Of course, how come they're Lepidoptera? Well, they've got scales on their wings. That's what Lepidos and Pteros means. Pteron means wing, and Lepidos is scales. Most butterflies and moths have sucking mouth parts, but a few don't. A few, like the moth butterfly, Lithira, for instance, has very rudimentary mouth parts, but most of the ones go seeking sugar fuel for their day-to-day activity as adults. Have to remember that the butterflies and moths we see fluttering around are in fact just the end point of a life cycle. People often ask me, how long do butterflies live? Well, as adults, they live anywhere from a couple of weeks to a year, depending on what species we're talking about, what environment they're experiencing. But every one of them has a long history of existence before that as an egg, as a caterpillar, a larva, and as a pupa. That's very important to remember. There's about 24,000 species of butterflies in the world, and new ones are being discovered regularly, about 400 in Australia. They are dwarfed by the moths, where we have possibly about 10,000 species in Australia and, or who knows, worldwide, but a very, very great many that are already described. This is the most recent, very recent tree of descent, starting in the middle for the butterflies. So you start here, and this is just how to squeeze it all into one picture. The interesting thing about this tree of descent for all the butterflies in the world is that until recently, butterfly people would talk about the true butterflies, the superfamily Papilionoidea, and the skippers, the Hesperioidea. Well, that's gone out of the window. So if any of, for instance, you are familiar with Debrera's early books on the butterflies of Australia, he absolutely denied that skippers were butterflies and he dismissed them. Well, sadly, we now know that the skippers, even though they might be a little bit weird, are embedded deeply in the middle of the whole evolutionary tree of butterflies. And if you want to identify a group which are most like the original butterflies back in the Cretaceous, probably, it's the swallowtails, the Papilionidae, the swallowtails and the triangles and this sort of thing, and the bird wings. Not the ones we see, of course, but their ancestors, but within the same family group. So that our whole bigger concept of the evolution of butterflies has actually changed recently, and courtesy of our molecular biological friends. But that is a very, very thorough study, which we can talk about later if anybody's interested. People always ask me, how do you tell a butterfly from a moth? Well, you know, there are three crucial things. Butterflies perch with their wings closed. Butterflies have clubs on their antennae. And guess what? Butterflies are flying around during the day and moths at night. However, I just like to point out that there are plenty of moths like this geometric down here, which perch just like butterflies. There are not plenty, but some moths with beautifully clubbed antennae, like this sun moth, the cashmere down here. This is a butterfly. Here, of course, this is a cashmere. And although butterflies are generally diurnal, flying around during the day, we have beautiful things like the red eyes, the common and rare red eye, which are famous for flying early in the evening. And of course, we have plenty of day flying moths, moths which don't just get kicked up during the day, but which habitually fly during the day and look. They're often very brightly colored, there's not much point in being very brightly colored if you're flying at night only. But when you're a day flying moth or a day flying butterfly for that matter, nice bright colors to talk to other butterflies or to scare your potential predators or whatever is a good thing. So there's plenty of day flying moths as well as butterflies. So how do we tell a butterfly from a moth? Well, first of all, we apply those three rules, and then we apply common sense, and then we go look them up. So where are they all? Well, as I said earlier, globally, there's about 24,000 species of butterflies. New ones are being discovered every year, and with modern molecular taxonomy, we're also splitting up things that previously were considered to be a single species. We now know that there's enough molecular difference between them that they couldn't breed together. Hence, they are, by definition, different species. As we get close to the tropics, there are more and more butterflies, and that's true globally as well as in Australia. As we go up mountains, we get fewer butterflies, although often more specialized ones, more the ones that are very local. But the true hotspots are tropical rainforests and tropical mountains in Australia and around the world. Here's a map I produced with a student of mine a few years ago, showing you where the Australian butterflies are. There's about 400 species, as I said, depending whether or not you include the Torres Strait or whether you include Christmas Island or whatever. And 2 or 3 new ones are added every year, either by exploring remote areas like the Torres Strait, or by more careful molecular analysis of just what we are looking at. Now, I'm talking species here. I'm not a great fan of subspecies, even though that is important from a conservation viewpoint. So you can see on this map that the biggest diversity is around the wet tropics. Cairns is somewhere here on the base of Cape York. The other hotspot is right up at the top of Cape York. Why? Well, because we're gathering up records of a whole bunch of what are essentially New Guinea species that just creep in as to those rainforest patches at Bamaga or Weeper or Iron Range. And that adds quite substantially up here, but it's a bunch of species that aren't found anywhere else, not surprisingly. The true tropical ones here include a lot of truly Australian butterflies. But as you can see, even in our part of the world down here, there are at least more than 150 species, between 150 and 200. And there's a whole group of butterflies which are unique to Southeast Queensland, I beg your pardon, Southeastern Australia. But as globally, as at the worldwide situation, diversity decreases with increasing latitude as we head towards Tassie, and elevation as we go up the mountains. But there's a very peculiar situation in Western Australia where there's a small number of butterflies, relatively speaking, but of course they tend to be unique Western endemics because they're isolated by this huge arid zone across the center of the continent. South Queensland, we have a very high diversity, and I quickly went through the maps in our beautiful book, go out and buy it, Bert and my volume on butterflies of Australia. So I just quickly skipped through the maps. And there's about 183 species in Southeast Queensland. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to find 180 species in the Sunshine Coast, because a lot of the southern ones, like this Banks Brown here, just sneak in the granite belt from the southeast cooler regions of Australia. And we also are on the southern end of some tropicals like this blue Argus and a number of others. But there are a few local endemics, that is butterflies that are found nowhere else. If in Southeast Queensland, I call them near endemics or almost endemics, because they also occur in Southeast Queensland and northeastern New South Wales. I'll talk about those in a moment. And then we get a few recent arrivals like the notorious tawny costa, which was until about 5 years ago, an Indonesian butterfly related to the glasswing, feeding on passiflora, passion flower vines, on both the introduced ones and the native ones. And it has spread from northwestern Australia right down into Southeast Queensland over the last few years. So watch out for this one on your survey. Now let's talk about the endemics. Well, the champion is the Richmond birdwing. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on the Richmond birdwing because frankly, everybody knows about it and the massive and very successful conservation effort that has been put into bringing it back from the remnant populations in the Sunshine Coast and north and separately further south over the last, 10, 15 years. I'll mention it as we go. But there are other endemics, which I call the also-rans. There is Illige's ant blue. I'll talk about these in more detail in a moment, which is found in mangroves from the Gold Coast, possibly up to somewhere in the Gympie region. I'll talk about that in a moment. Here is the famous, I call it the Darling Downs jewel. Other people call it the Bull Oak jewel. Common names, English names, you can take your choice, which only occurs in that couple of locations on the Darling Downs near Toowoomba. But then there is this guy, the Saturn opal, which just creeps in near the Kalula sandmass and then goes out towards central Queensland. But it is a special butterfly that doesn't get enough attention, the so-called satin opal. And then, of course, there is the sad old Australian fritillary, which is quite possibly extinct. But when I first got an interest in Australian butterflies, was found from Gympie down to Port Macquarie. The last sightings were just north of Port Macquarie. There's a few questionable sightings subsequently, but it hasn't been seen for years, I'm afraid. So these particular species illustrate the whole range of life cycles in butterflies, which is what I want to talk about now. The Richmond birdwing, the satin opal, and the Australian fritillary have, or in the case of the fritillary, had very standard life cycles, boring life cycles, if you wish. This is a little life cycle I got from a primary school teaching site. And, you know, we go from egg to larva to pupa to the butterfly itself. And this is the pattern for most butterflies. All of the swallowtails, the Papilionidae, all of the whites and yellows, all of the skippers, all of the browns, all of the nymphs, and about half of the blues, the Lycaenidae, which are a group I'm particularly interested in and I will come to in a moment. So if we talk about the Richmond birdwing and the satin opal, okay, so they go through the standard life cycle that, you know, school kids can observe and play with in the cabbage white. But the interesting thing, what becomes interesting, is what the larvae eat. So the Richmond birdwing, as almost everybody knows, feed on just two species of Dutchman's pipevine, Aristolochia, one in the lowland, one in the upland. And the big conservation effort has been increasing the plantings of the lowland species of Aristolochia, and has been very successful. If we go up to the satin opal, the Lycaenia species, like for all four species of opal, that is members of that genus, they are closely associated with one or more species of Boronia, the native genus that we are familiar with from garden plantings. So they're quite specific, and anybody interested in the health of populations of any butterfly has to think about how well is the food plant doing. And if there was one thing I was going to emphasize as fundamental, that is it. The adult butterflies feed on nectar, feed on flowers, most of them do anyway, and they'll exploit a very wide range of flowers, including a lot of exotics that people plant in gardens. Even lantana is quite a good butterfly nectar source, but there are many, many others. That isn't the key point in the life cycle. It's what the larvae eat. And just to add, even the Australian fritillary, there's just this one species of long-leaved violet, Viola betonicifolia, that it feeds on or fed on, a plant of boggy areas that agriculturalists love to drain and destroy. In at least one case in the Sunshine Coast area, deliberately, but that's another matter. In comparison, there are butterflies like the tailed emperor, which seem to eat almost anything. I mean, its native food plants are acacias and brachychitons of various kinds, corydones, flame trees, but it'll feed on a whole range of other things, as long as they're not strongly chemically protected. It's an extreme case, but many other species are quite broad in what they'll feed on. The ones that end up being of conservation concern often are the ones with specialist larval food demands. Let's move now to the Darling Downs jewel, which is characteristic of a lot of blue butterflies. And as somebody what else once said, there are more than two people in this marriage. It's not just the plant and the butterfly. There are ants involved, and the ants tend the caterpillars. The caterpillars produce exudates, chemicals from some specialized glands, which the ants collect, carry back to their nests, and the ants in return protect the caterpillars from a certain proportion of their predators and parasites. So it's a mutualistic relationship. Both sides benefit. The thing about the Darling Downs jewel is it needs a particular genus of ants, Ananicomyrma, but it also needs these old growth bull oaks up on the edge of the brigalow belt. And of course, as you can see that from that photograph, most of that area has been completely cleared for agriculture because of its soil qualities. More than all of our blue butterflies are attended by, of the larvae are looked after to a greater or lesser degree by ants. This is the Zosini, Ojaris zosini, also found in southeast Queensland. And here are Camponotus ants, sugar ants, looking after the larvae and even exploiting the glands on the larval rear end. Very many of these blue butterflies have an additional complication because they feed on very specific mistletoes. The mistletoes sometimes are associated with particular sorts of trees. So there's a fourth player in the game, and this is one reason why often, if you look at our list of most vulnerable butterflies globally, there are a few normal species like the Richmond birdwing, but there are far more lycaenids that have these 3 or 4 players in their well-being. And that means, of course, that if anything goes wrong with either the ant population, the mistletoe population, the food plant population, then that impacts on the butterflies themselves. These are mutualistic relationships, as we call it. It's positive for the larvae, they get the ants look after them. It's positive for the ant because it collects up the sugars and amino acids that the larvae secrete. Then let's look at villages ant blue, the mangrove blue, and the worm terns, because this species of butterfly, this species of lycaenid, is also ant-associated. It lays its eggs close to a particular ant nest, and the ant nest lives in dead, hollow twigs that stick out from mangroves. It lays its eggs, and the early larva emerges. It's collected by the ants and carried back into the nest. And there, it turns out to be a bit of a cuckoo, because instead of simply feeding on the plant, coming out feeding on the plant at night, it stays in the nest and eats the ant grubs. It's carnivorous. And there are, this particular habit is typical of all the ant blues, all the Acrodipsis species, but it's also evolved a couple of other times in the lycaenids at large, an extraordinary thing. And just in a few other cases dotted around elsewhere in the order Lepidoptera. Fascinating, but once again, you can imagine that this is a species that needs the right ant, but it also needs the mangrove, the mangrove edge. And of course, mangroves are a wonderful challenge to developers who want to build canal estates, and the canal estates have essentially driven this species to vulnerability. So if I may begin to conclude, the big butterfly count. There are a few hints for beginners. Again, I may be teaching my grandmother to suck eggs here. But first of all, butterflies love flowers. If you're looking for adult butterflies, look for generally, especially the males, the nectar sources. And as I say, you don't need to restrict yourself to native flowers, although a nectar resource close to a larval food plant resource is an ideal situation. And butterflies love edges. And what I mean by that is, if I were trying to maximize my count of butterflies on the Sunshine Coast, I would try and find a rainforest patch, and I would walk around its outside very carefully, especially those areas that are not absolutely choked with exotic grasses, for instance. But they love edges. In fact, there are very few butterflies in the Australian fauna. This is not true of Southeast Asia. Very few butterflies that are found inside rainforests. They're found around the edge. In open savannas, sort of eucalypt forests, it's a little bit different because you don't get quite the same distinction between the forest and the non-forest. Some species are very habitat specific. If you want to see the black and white tiger, if you want to see the salt marsh blue, if you want to see Illige's ant blue, then you better go to salt marsh or mangroves. If you want to see the blues associated with the many species associated with mistletoes, then you better find a bunch of eucalypts or casuarinas that are heavily infested with mistletoes, but you'd better have a net with a 4-meter handle. And the other thing, I can't stress enough in terms of producing data which can go on to iNaturalist and be useful, you must remember that there are several groups, genera of local butterflies that really cannot be easily separated except in the hand. If you get a really striking photograph of a fresh male Toxidia skipper, for instance, then yes, we can probably do something with it. But to try and be confident about some of the skippers, the Toxidias, the tiny little grass darts, the Ossibadistes, Taratrosera sunniana, you're going to have a net, you're going to have to catch them, and you're going to have a very careful look about them. And you're going to have in your head or in your backpack a reference book so that you can compare the sex brands, for instance, on the male forewings. So it's better scientifically to just say a Toxidia species than it is to make a stab at what you're looking at without being confident. If it's a very common species and you don't have any ethical issues, collect 1 or 2, mount them up, and then identify them. I'm afraid that's why collection is very much part of the professional approach to butterflies. You're not going to have a massive impact on diversity or God's creation, for that matter, if that's how you see things, by removing a couple of individuals. However, that's entirely up to you. Photography is great, but it only goes so far. Sometimes you need to see, for some of the blues, the upper side and the underside. Indeed, if you haven't got a good picture, a very clear picture of that arrangement of spots on the underside, then there will always be doubt about exactly what you're looking at. That doesn't mean you can't do a great deal. There are many, many species out there that can be identified confidently as they fly past. But do please be careful. It's not as easy as all that. If you were a bird watcher, imagine seeing female flycatchers or female little brown jobs and trying to distinguish them on the wing. Very, very difficult. Anyway, good hunting. I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Bert, whose paintings I have shamelessly taken from our book, scanned and used in this talk. Bert is a resident of the Gold Coast, I beg your pardon, of the Sunshine Coast, and one of the best butterfly people around. Although, as you can see from this set of his books, he's really into dragonflies and damselflies as well. Thank you all for listening. If you see one of these coppers, then you're in the wrong continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. If you'd like to unshare your screen, I've got a few questions.
Unmute. Oh, there we go.
There you are. Wonderful.
Good.
Now I'm going to take you a little bit into the conservation conversation, if that's okay.
Please.
Given you've done studies all over the world in rainforests, and you've offered so much. Given this point in time, what would you say are some of the biggest threats to the survival of butterfly populations, not just here in Australia, but globally, and then Queensland focused and then Sunshine Coast focused, if you can?
There are two things that are critical, and they're intimately linked together. Number one is loss of habitat. Loss of habitat. If you bulldoze Brigalow, you will end up with a few tiny remnant populations which are inevitably vulnerable, endangered. The pale imperial blue, for example, Gelminus ubulus is a case in point. So is the bull oak jewel that I've spoken about, and there are others. And there are beetles and other species that are also opaque. So clearing bush. And that interacts with the fact that if, having cleared the bush, you're developing broad scale agriculture, you're going to use pesticides. Of course you are. After all, the purpose of agriculture is to maximize production, not to maximize biodiversity. So, for instance, the current use of nicotinamide insecticides isn't good for any insects. And once you've got small isolated populations, they become more vulnerable to other threats like nicotinamide insecticides. So those two things are crucial. That having been said, there are a great many ways in which individuals can work for butterflies, in addition to protesting habitat clearance, which of course is a bit like shutting the door after the horses bolted. You can increase, there's wonderful work going on elsewhere in the world, turning gardens into mini forests, for instance. What do you plant and all the rest of it. This won't bring back the incredibly endangered rare species in general. A few, and the Richmond birdwing is a case in point, are so mobile that, I don't live in rainforest here at Cedar Creek, but I've had birdwings occasionally in the garden because they wander down from the rainforest on Mount Tambourine. And if I had had the energy to plant a great wall of Aristolochia, then I would probably have a population here, even though I live in eucalypt woodland, not rainforest. So anyway, those are the two things, insecticides but interaction with habitat clearance, which is numero uno.
And in the introduction, we mentioned your work looking at the impacts of climate change. Can you speak to a little bit about that?
Yes. I mean, we know in Australia and particularly in Europe, where there are many, many more researchers, but there is good work out of Leslie Hughes's lab at Macquarie Uni, showing that over the past 20, 30 years, species of butterflies have begun to move as temperature regimes change. So in Europe, many species have moved north into Scandinavia or to the more northerly parts of Scandinavia, which never occurred there before. In Australia, species are moving south. I mean, you could argue that Terpsichore, the tawny costa, is a case in point. But there are other things. Some of the tropical crow butterflies, the euployers, are turning up in ones and twos in Brisbane where they never occurred before. And that's true for dragonflies as well. There's a couple of species of dragonfly now well established in southeast Queensland that previously were thought to have their southern limits somewhere around the Rockhampton area. So they are following what we call their physiological envelope or physiological preferences. As soon as it's warmer, they move south, or they move upwards. Now, we don't have any evidence, for butterflies, we don't have any strong evidence for that in Australia because we don't have that many high elevation butterflies. And indeed, our mountains are itsy bitsy things compared with the Alps or the Himalaya or the Rockies, but it's certainly happening elsewhere. There are two problems with that. As you move upwards, of course, as things warm up, you eventually run out of places to go. And similarly, if you move south or north, depending on which hemisphere you're in, seeking to avoid high temperatures, that will leave a sort of gap in the more extreme areas. And there hasn't been a lot of work done on that, but I suspect that will then be invaded by some really vigorous weeds and other tropical invaders, possibly including some butterflies, we don't know. But that's one of the unknowns. What happens to, if you like, areas that are vacated because of climate pressures? A lot of work still to do.
Sounds like it. There's another question here for you, and this comes up a lot in conservation work and citizen science work. For us working in this field as well, we can get really excited about doing all these community projects, and then those questions that come up is like, why even bother? Why is this so important? Why is protecting butterfly species so important, and what do they do in the ecosystems?
Right. Well, there's several aspects to that question. The first point is that it's hard enough to get governments and agencies to change their policies and their practices in favor of biodiversity conservation in general. We all know that. We've all been involved in battles and fights and debates all my career, and it's not stopping. The very best arguments we have as those engaged in collecting data, whether we're citizen scientists, professional scientists, or whoever, is to say, look, here are the numbers. And they can choose to ignore that and say, look, I'd rather take notice of what the Hillsong preacher is preaching. Or they can respond and say, look, we're going to take a scientific approach. Sorry, I'm letting my biases show there, but I'm sorry about that. I'm a scientist. Why butterflies? Well, invertebrates, as the recently, late E.O. Wilson said, are the little things that run the world. They are the decomposers, the things that turn over rotting material. They are the pollinators. They are the things that prevent plants exploding into outbreak situations, and so on and so forth. Invertebrates are tricky because, for instance, let's say we all decided we were going to study decomposer flies, which I have done in my time, but nevertheless, the taxonomy, our understanding of diversity, our ability to recognize them is definitely a game for professionals or near professionals. You know, you try sort out one mossed housefly type fly from another. You've got to start counting spines on the sides of thoraxes and things like that. Butterflies are different because butterflies, you can learn to identify that, first of all, there aren't too many of them, 400 species globally, 150 species in Southeast Queensland, if you're including absolutely everything. Yes, it's a bit of work to become familiar with them, but it can be done. And it can be done in a way that produces reliable data. So suddenly, butterflies become a beacon for all invertebrates. And there's plenty of work out there showing that if the butterflies are declining, so are all the other invertebrates. Or vice versa, if the butterflies are doing well, then the ecosystem's in a pretty good state. And if you were so foolish as to study collembola, springtails, then you probably find they were doing pretty well as well. So butterflies are an accessible, one of the very few accessible fractions of the invertebrates, and the invertebrates run the world. So that's why it's important.
Wonderful. And they are pretty beautiful and easy to fall in love
with. They're also beautiful, and they will get you out there, and they will be a lifelong passion. I started my passion for butterflies when I was 13, living in the East Riding of Yorkshire in northern England, which happens to have the least diversity of butterflies of anywhere in the UK. If you took every last species, including a couple that had disappeared, I think we got 17. But it was a great place to learn everything there was to know about these things. And of course, to read and read and read and read and read and read about Alfred Russel Wallace collecting butterflies in Southeast Asia. What a man, what a man, my hero. You can keep Darwin. It was Wallace who was out there knee deep in sludge, collecting bird wings in Bachian, and coming up with the revolutionary idea that Darwin did, but based not on Galapagos tortoises, but based on swallowtail butterflies in the islands of Southeast Asia. My hero.
Thank you, Roger. I was actually one of your first year students back in 2009. So it's really beautiful to hear you talk again tonight with such passion. I do have a comment or question that's come in via Facebook. It's from Julie, and she asks, what plants should a suburban house owner plant for our endemic Greenbank Oxley Creek butterflies? Any suggestions?
Well, the first thing to do is, there are some generic things. You can plant pentis, you can plant some of the good nectar plants, which aren't necessary. It depends whether you're trying to restore an ecosystem or grow a garden. If you're trying to restore an ecosystem, please don't plant exotic plants. But if you're growing a garden, having some good tubular purple or white flowers which butterflies love for nectaring, then I don't have a problem with that. After all, it's a garden. It's not a wild ecosystem. But what you really need to do, and you could do this by looking at some of the guidebooks is, first of all, make a list of what butterflies you might expect in that area. And the good thing about butterflies is we know their life histories of virtually all of them. So look them up and look at what, usually it's the genus level. There are a few species of butterfly that just want one species, like the Richmond birdwing. But in other cases, there are a great many species that live on feathery-leaved acacias, for instance, Acacia irorata, Acacia, I can't remember all the names, but there's lots of them. They don't even need to be absolutely local, especially bearing in mind with a changing climate, what goes well locally today might not be the perfect species for 20 years from now, when hopefully the plant will still be alive. So you've got to start with a tentative list of butterflies and then work back from that. Do your homework. It's not difficult to do. You can do it on Google. You can do it with Braby's guidebook. You can do it with our guidebook, or Peter Valentine's new book, or Gary Sankovsky's book, which really concentrates on food plants, although Gary's biggest experience is in the wet tropics, but he's still writing about all butterflies. So that's how I would approach it. Then find out what things are available from the native plant nurseries, and then, you know, plant them and develop them. And look, you will have success. You may not attract exactly the butterfly you want, but you will bring in butterflies. And any butterflies are better than no butterflies, unless you grow cabbages.
And just kind of rolling on from that home garden theme, are there any must-dos or do-nots when considering creating the home garden environment for butterfly habitat?
Well, the most barren gardens I've seen are those that try to build English country gardens. And I have to say, people who live up in the hills in both the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast hinterland sometimes are displaced POMs like myself, and they start trying to create an English cottage garden. And you can do that. Stuff will grow, but you'll get half a dozen totally boring butterflies there, species. You will not get species. And I won't go into specifics, but we have belonged to a couple of garden clubs, and you go to some gardens and you think, this is absolutely spectacular array of color and hard work, and it's absolutely useless for any part of Australian biodiversity. So that's number one. The second thing is, for example, if you're anywhere near a Richmond birdwing habitat, then planting the big Dutchman's pipe vine, I can't remember his species name, it's another Aristolochia, will kill the butterflies. And it will, similarly, it will kill Cressida, the big greasy butterfly as well. Because they're Aristolochias and their sensory behavior attracts them to almost any Aristolochia. They lay eggs on there, but when the larvae emerge, they will take a few bites and die. So if you're really looking for some of those species of butterfly that are very specific, then yes, you need to do a bit of research, because there are things that kill butterflies as well as encourage them, in addition to species that will encourage them.
Yes, thank you. And I just on that, I probably would like to mention that local native nurseries are often a really great resource for people to pop in and have a chat to. You know, we've got Coolum Native Community Nursery involved in this project. Mooloolah River Landcare has a fantastic butterfly habitat garden. Forest Heart Nursery, and then of course the Barung Nursery. The staff there often will have a great basic knowledge of what species are great to plant on your soil type, in your garden, wherever you are on the coast or in the hinterland. So they're a great resource to tap into.
You've got to be a bit careful. One of the native nurseries I go to a lot, still sells a particular plant labeled as the Ulysses blue, the mountain blue papilio food plant, which indeed it is, but it doesn't occur south of Yungala, south of Mackay. So you can plant the plant, Euodia, and it'll grow perfectly well, but you won't get any mountain blues down here. So, and it's got a big label on it with a picture of the butterfly saying this is the food plant of the mountain blue. And indeed it is. But if you think taking one home is going to attract that butterfly, then you better start shipping them down from Mackay.
Do your research and ask
Absolutely.
questions. There is one more question in the chat here, not so much related to butterflies, but what's happening with the bogong moth, if you know anything about that.
Well, yes, I do. I began my life in Australia in 1971 in Canberra, working for the CSIRO. And the late, great Ian Common, whose Moth and Butterfly books you may have read, took me up to Mount Gingera to see the bogong moth. And in the little caves on the top of the mountain there, they were just absolutely packed with millions and millions and millions of this otherwise rather boring brown moth, the bogong moth. And there are stories of the air conditioning intake ducts on Parliament House getting blocked up. And they were estivating, the opposite of hibernating, coming in to spend the hot part of the season. And they were coming from all of the southern tablelands into the snowies and the brindabellas and those slightly higher areas. An amazing biological phenomenon, which now apparently, I have no personal experience, but apparently that hardly happens anymore. And you can only suppose that's because, and this is speculation, of agricultural practices in the southern tablelands. After all, you can't have millions of moths which breed elsewhere. They don't breed in the mountains. They come and estivate in the mountains, spend their summers in the mountains. And I suspect broad-scale agriculture with its associated use of fertilizers, and don't forget fertilizers can be just as lethal to native fauna as pesticides. I suspect that has simply reduced the numbers massively. It's very hard to know what you can do about that, because the bogong moth phenomenon takes in all of the southern tablelands. And because in the winter months, the cooler months, this population spreads over a vast area of the southern tablelands, central tablelands, which then focuses on the mountaintops in the peak of the summer. So as a phenomenon, it's geographically very wide, and it certainly spreads, although the estivating sites are in national parks generally, the areas that are producing the individuals that estivate are general agricultural productive lands. But we shouldn't get too prissy about this, because we as a nation and a species depend on that agricultural productivity for our lifestyle and our long-term viability and expansion. So it's very easy to say, oh, well, the farmers should do this and the farmers should do that. But we, generally speaking, rely on the industrial, in the broadest sense, base of our country to allow us, for instance, to have these wonderful internet connections, to be well-dressed and well-fed, well-educated, and have these discussions. So it's always a balancing act. you can be an extremist, and we need extremists because they're the ones who point up the questions. But the whole biodiversity conservation debate is broader than that. It's about human lifestyles, human sociology, human psychology, human reproduction. So before I go off on a complete tangent, all I'm saying is I don't really see any way we could tackle the bogong problem, moth problem. We're not going to exterminate the species. It's one of the most broadly distributed species in Australia. But the phenomenon, little bit like the monarchs estivating in Mexico, the phenomenon is probably never going to be quite as dramatic as it was 30 years ago. Sorry.
Okay, just highlighting the complexity of some of these issues in the conversation. So that we're still exploring. And just to wrap up, there's just one final question. I know we're a tiny bit like on the edge of our time here, but I think it's one worth asking. It comes from Denise. Back in early 2020, just before we went into COVID lockdown, we had a huge explosion of blue tigers, and can remember this happening once before in the 25 years that she's lived here on the coast. Why does this happen, and why does this not happen more? Thank you.
A very good question. First of all, blue tigers do not breed in southeast Queensland. They visit, rather like Sydney-siders coming to the Gold Coast. Blue tigers fly down the coast from the tropics or from warmer areas. In some years, by their million, or yeah, probably by their million. And they become a very common butterfly. But it does point out something which, the period your questioner, Bernice, is talking about, I think, coincided with a period which was very, very good for butterflies, certainly in the Gold Coast hinterland where I live. A couple of years ago, I suspect, by the way, this year is going to, over the next few weeks, because of the rain and all of the growth that's gone on, as long as we don't get more torrential rain, which butterflies don't like, they like light rain, they don't like torrential rain, I think it's also going to be very good. But Australian butterfly populations, like almost everything else in this country of ours, are very variable. And you can have drier years when it's very hard to see one or two individuals of your favorite species. Other years, suddenly they're everywhere. That is the nature of our continent for the most part. So when people talk about global decline of butterflies, now I don't doubt this is happening in Europe. There's been a lot of writing about this over the last couple of years. I think we should just be a bit cautious before jumping on that bandwagon in Australia. Yes, things are declining, but is it the end of the world as we know it in terms of ecosystem services? I don't know, because most parts of Australia are adapted at the ecosystem level to huge amounts of variability. So the reason all those blue tigers came shooting down into Bernice's garden was because of conditions further north. Now, I can't recollect what those conditions were, but clearly it was a good year for tigers, blue tigers, in Mackay, Rockhampton, Townsville, and Points North. And they did so well that they had to leave. Well, they do that every year. They don't all leave, but the southern population of blue tigers, as far as I'm aware, is essentially a throwaway population. There might be the odd breeding event down here, but they're doomed, like a lot of the yellow migrants we see, or the Cape Whites. So they'll form local populations, but their core breeding area is elsewhere. So I think that's the answer to that question. But variability is what butterfly populations in Australia are all about. That's why it's very hard to predict exactly what you're going to see in a big butterfly count.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up, but thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, and thank you to everybody who submitted a question to keep the conversation rolling. And I'm just going to share my screen so you have that link to the big butterfly count, and you can get involved in the week-long events that are happening here on the Sunshine Coast. So down the bottom there, www.mary-cancross.sunshinecoast.qld.gov.au. And if you head on over to that website, you'll see a whole range of really exciting events, but in particular is the butterfly count. And you'll see the public counts you can get involved in, some workshops to remain throughout the week, and also some instructions on how to download that app and start counting from your very own backyard. So thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night.